And hello, everyone. We are back and we are checking out 19th and 20th century medicine is kind of crucial for, like, your survival. And we're alive and you're alive and, you know, medicine. It's kind of important. But the first type of thing I actually want to start with is mixing it up a little bit here and talking about the medicine, if you will, of the mind. Mental illness is something that is very important for us to understand, and we're getting better at it, and treatments are getting better in the world today, but we definitely need to keep our focus on it. For my little public service announcement here, I think it is an important thing that people need to be aware of. And the guy that really revolutionized all of that is Sigmund Freud, and I have here he would like to talk with you. Sigmund Freud was a psychologist, and he lived from 1856 through 1939, and he was from Austria. And what was so important for this man is we really see him as the founder of psychoanalysis. Now, I could spend, tons and tons of time talking about the id and the ego and all of these types of crazy theories he had and analyzing dreams and stuff for that. And you can feel free to check that out if you want. But I think what's really crucial for Freud, because a lot of people often get like too focused on, like, he talked about, some types of sexual ideas and things along that line, which are fairly controversial. But I think what's really important here is to understand the dedication that this guy had to understanding people. Okay, and these ideas that by using what is called psychoanalysis, that a psychologist sitting down and talking with people and letting people express themselves and allowing people to kind of get what they can out of their own mind, and this idea of the conscious and the unconscious, that there are things that drive you that you're not really aware of, that you've been you know impacted as a younger person or at some point in your life, and it's so crucial for you to understand yourself. And Freud had a variety of different techniques in which he could talk to people and develop treatments for people, and all of those types of things are really, really important for us to understand. And that idea, the acceptance of people of social that have mental illness, and that they can be talked to, and we shouldn't just like shun them and throw them out, of a home, or something along that line, and just throwing people into facilities where, you might not need that. This idea of therapy, which is very important today, so much to the point where, actual, you know, insurance companies will cover that type of stuff. And Freud really broke all that out. And that is something I think that is really, really important for us to understand in the study of mental illness. And Freud really helped us with that. And all of his kind of disciples, if you will, and from his daughter to other research assistants to other people that came up with theories that dispute his, but hey, that's okay because he really got the ball rolling. And I love this quote here by him: being entirely honest with yourself is a good exercise. And I think that's something that we should all take a deeper look at. Now, when it comes to modern medicine, the guy that is really crucial is Louis Pasteur. And that's interesting. My picture in the background disappeared. That's upsetting, but that's okay. We're just gonna keep going on. Louis Pasteur is the man. He started off as a chemist, and he started studying fermentation and things along that line. And the fact of the matter is that many people up to this point didn't really know where illnesses came from. They believed in spontaneous, generation of things, and a lot of people really struggled trying to identify why we get sick. Remember, in the Middle Ages, which, by the way, only about 300 years before Pasteur's time, he lived 1822 to 1895. People thought, if you bathed in the winter, you would die. But he developed, it is the most important thing in all of medicine is germ theory. And this idea that there are these microbes, which other guys would discover and understand, and creating microscopes and stuff like that, that cause illnesses. And if we can fight and beat germs, that indeed we can understand disease a lot better, and create medicines to do that. And that was just absolutely huge. And from his work, he actually, inoculations had been around prior to him. Probably the most famous one was the inoculation initially created by Edward Jenner for smallpox. But he created one for rabies. Now, smallpox is a deadly disease, but rabies, if left untreated, it kills you 100% of the time. You're all going to die. However, if you get bit by an animal that is believed to have rabies and you get a rabies vaccine, you're going to be okay. It's pretty incredible. And his work would also lead to vaccines against polio, which I'll talk about that guy in a moment, and typhus. So to say that Pasteur is the top is probably still an understatement, and a guy really, really crucial for us to understand. And spawning off of him was Jonas Salk. Now, Jonas Salk is special, and the reason why I talk about him are a couple different things. And you might have heard in other history classes, he's often talked about in U.S. history classes for the guy that founded the polio vaccine. But his vaccine was really important because he changed the face of vaccines. Polio was a disease that could impact so many different people. And sometimes it's really hard to make a vaccine, and there's a danger that someone that gets vaccines could get the illness because they would use live vaccines to or live diseases to create it. So in some people they would get a reaction to it. Jonas Salk, using the work of Louis Pasteur, pioneered the idea of actually creating a vaccine out of a dead virus, which would really limit the possibility of a virus from actually getting created. And in the end, um, it was successful. And he was able to make this vaccine, but what was more important, he gave it away. He didn't care who it was, he gave it away. He wasn't trying to make money. This is incredible, and it helped to actually end polio, not only in the United States, but eventually worldwide. And that is an absolutely crucial thing. And so this guy, you can't say enough about him. And then we have, penicillin. Alexander Fleming, the idea that he kind of did it by accident, that he had, was growing mold, and he kept the petri dish too close to another thing that had some bacteria in it, and he noticed that the mold that grew into the bacteria killed the bacteria, and he was like, interesting, and he was able to develop penicillin. Now, penicillin is the end-all and be-all of all, like the idea of the antibiotic, that there are so many things that used to kill people that they're just not going to. Now, the problem that we have, though, is that occasionally people use a little bit too much of it, and we do have the development of of penicillin-resistant bacteria, that there are certain bacteria that we can't kill anymore because they're resistant to the penicillin because they have been exposed to it. Because remember, bacteria, viruses, they're living things. They can come back and then they can do some damage. So in the end, we have to be careful about using too much penicillin. But the fact of the matter is this was remarkable. This changed everything, and the access to this type of medicine was huge. And the other guy that I always like to talk about is Joseph Lister. Joseph Lister developed antiseptic practices in surgery. The fact of the matter is, in the 1800s, if you went to the hospital, there was just a good chance of you getting sick and dying there than getting better. And a lot of it was because of bacteria and other things that were spreading around. But interestingly, if Joseph Lister was obsessed with this, and he was obsessed with trying to stop people dying. And one ward of hospitals that he noticed where people didn't seem to get as sick was the maternity ward. And when he investigated, he noticed that most midwives, that after they helped give a woman give birth, did something crazy and they washed their hands. And then everything kind of clicked. And these ideas of how to do surgical scrubbing, how to keep things clean, how to sanitize items, all came from Joseph Lister. And now when you go to the hospital, odds are you're going to get better instead of getting more sick. Now, before I talk about these guys, we have other things. We talked about Gregory Pincus and the birth control pill early on. We get rid of smallpox. In 1967, a guy is going to do the world's first heart transplant, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the idea of surgery and that we can operate on everything, prior to these two gentlemen here, The one on the left is Alfred Blaylock, and on the right is Vivian Thomas. The idea of operating on the heart was never thought to happen until these two men decided we're going to fix it. And this didn't start with the fact that people had heart attacks and stuff like that. Now, the fact if you have a heart attack, we can do surgery and you might not die, it's kind of remarkable. But there were children that developed that had a kind of birth defect in their heart, and it was called blue baby syndrome because it prevented oxygen from being properly distributed, and kids would basically turn blue and die. And Alfred Blaylock decided that that can't happen. And so, working out of um, John Hopkins University in Maryland, he and his assistant, now I say assistant, Vivian Thomas. Unfortunately, because of the way the world was, Vivian Thomas lost most of his money that he was going to try to go to med school with in the Great Depression. And then when he was older, it was very difficult for him to get a job, basically due to his race. Well, he started off as a lab assistant for Alfred Blaylock and then slowly but surely rose up to become his most trusted assistant. The fact of the matter is this man had the ability to do surgery, he had the hands, he had the know-how, and without him, Blaylock would have never been able to pull this off. But in the 1950s, they were able to actually operate on a child and be successful. And they were able to reroute the blood and keep the child alive during the surgery. And it was the moment that you can operate on the heart and we can fix these things. And science was just progressing at such a rapid pace that we were really advancing the world. And there was a reason we had to do all this stuff because you were getting now the birth of a worldwide epidemics. Because remember, we've talked about disease a lot, whether it's me, whether it's John Green. But in 1918 and 1919, we really saw what the internet connectedness of the world could do with the Spanish flu epidemic. Now, it was influenza, and they called it the Spanish flu because it's kind of where they adopted it. The fact of the matter is it actually started in Kansas. And the flu went basically from the Arctic all the way to every island that you could possibly imagine. We think that it was an avian strand of the flu, that it's some type of bird flu. But here's the deal, guys. 500 million people were infected by this. 50 to 100 million people died. 500 people meant that 1/3 of the entire population of the world, think about that for a second, 1 out of every 3 people got the flu in a year. It's absurd. And now 50 to 100 million people died from it. You can't even conceptualize this, or at least I have a problem conceptualizing this, thinking that 1/3 of all the people I know, maybe me included, could get sick. That's nuts. But we realized that of how much better practices we needed to go and how these diseases could spread, and we need to be more effective in stopping them. And the problem is that there keeps being another one that comes out. In the 1980s, you had the huge spread of HIV and AIDS across the world. Now, we're not going to get into, the specifics of all of them, of how AIDS started and whatnot. But the idea here is that this was a disease that was primarily spread through sexual transmission, as well as through infected blood through transfusions. And the initial impact of this was really, really huge because, unfortunately, it had a lot of negative connotations. People were scared of those that had the disease. Some people were driven out of their towns, or kids, the most famous probably being the Ryan White case in the United States. There was a young boy that was actually driven from his school and town because people didn't know about it. Still in certain places today, you have people that are shunned because they don't have education on it. It led to an increase in discrimination against homosexuals, primarily because the early population in which people were identified of having AIDS were homosexual. But the thing is that those were people that were going and getting checked out by doctors. Eventually, of course, we know it's not a homosexual disease because there is no such thing. I repeat, there is no such thing as a homosexual disease. But there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of scaredness, if you will. But here's the thing. As we learn more of it, we develop a intense awareness, and then we're able to develop education plans to prevent the spread, because that's the key thing about HIV and AIDS. It is a preventable disease. You can stop it from going around to other people as long as they know how to protect themselves and things along that line. because in areas where they're lacking education, so for instance, let me talk about sub-Saharan Africa for a moment. 14% of all cases of AIDS in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. You have 12 million orphans. You've had tens of millions of people that died, particularly in the 90s. You were having like average life expectancy in some nations was like 38 to 43 because so many people were dying from AIDS. But now that we're starting to turn the corner, we developed these things called antiretroviral drugs that can put the virus to sleep so people can live longer. You can still spread it. You got to be careful. But the fact of the matter is we can prevent the spread of it from mother to child. So we're doing all of these things, but medicine, we have to continue to advance because as we go on, there's all these new threats that are out there. And one of the scariest was in the 1990s and starting in 2014, the Ebola epidemic. Now, Ebola is crazy because it can spread from human to human through people coughing in the air, and then they get these blood follicles in the air, and then you can, you breathe them in, and then you can get it. And now, currently, we've kind of calmed down a little bit, but like I said, 2014, 15 into parts of 16, you had an outbreak in Sierra Leone. It's been in primarily Western Africa. We even had some American people get it. This is a crazy disease. You see this guy that's all like crazy here, and sometimes that might even not even stop it. And so what Ebola teaches us is how fast these diseases can spread and how we need to constantly protect ourselves. And I know it sounds scary, but we are doing a pretty good job of it. But something else that we're using, medicine and science, if you were, is to help feed people. In the 1950s and 40s, we had something known as the Green Revolution, this idea and the concept of spreading agricultural technology and new types of plants and crops around the world so that we can feed everybody because populations were growing so fast. And this has been incredibly successful because we have the concept here of not only we spreading the idea of farm technology, but also the use of chemical fertilizers, which I know many people get scared of. However, here's the deal. So there's a plus and a minus either because I have current controversies. Norman Borlaug is the guy that's huge here. Okay, he was the one that came up with this. He was a scientist. He was able to develop these things, okay? And he wanted to start this in the 1940s when India had millions of people die due to a series of famines from the 40s really through the 70s. And guys like Borlaug were like, this is absurd. We should be able to do and create food so that all these people don't die. We can't have this happening. So what he started with was expansion of irrigation, helping infrastructure, management techniques, all that type of stuff. But then they started to create what is called the GMO, the genetically modified organism, primarily in the form of rice and wheat. Now, I do understand that many people get nervous about this stuff because there are some genetically modified organisms that have created things like allergies, and some people have gotten sick from them. But the fact of the matter also is that millions of people aren't dead because of new hybrid type seeds, drought resistant grains that are able to be grown in areas of little to no water, and so that millions of people aren't dead. So it's a really tough call either way, but it's kind of important. And look at this life expectancy. The average age, my graph got cut off a little bit, but, down here we have, the 50s, and then up here we're into the 70s and the 80s. And that is the story of medicine, okay? Longer life expectancy, with medicine and food and things along that line. And so we'll talk a lot about this more stuff in class. Make sure you get some comments and questions, and I'll see you soon.